Okay, so now let's create some Firebase functions, and I'm going to go over the high level, but again, this isn't going to be a course dedicated to Firebase functions. We're mainly going to scratch the surface, but we are going to learn a decent amount, especially how to take this tool and actually apply it to our project. Like that's what I'm trying to teach you here, not like every little detail about Firebase functions. So you can get to that under the build group, and it should be somewhere down here. I already have it open here. And if you click get started, it'll kind of walk you through some of the basic steps. The first is going to be to install the Firebase CLI. You can see this is being installed globally. We're not going to install it like in a specific package. And the next step is going to be to initialize a project. So I'm actually going to walk you through that right now. Now, of course, I already have it installed, but I'll just uninstall it real quick just to show you what it's like. So this is how we're going to run the install. This is the particular command. I guess it probably isn't super interesting. I might not have needed to show it to you. Basically, it's going to take a few seconds and then we're going to be done. Okay, cool. So that finished and it took quite a bit for me. I don't know how long it's going to take for you, but just like with the G-Cloud CLI, we want to authenticate with our user and our project that we created. So you can do that with Firebase login, and it's going to prompt us to collect information. I'm just going to say no. And then it gives us this authentication URL. So I'm going to copy it and open it in my window. And you probably know how to do this part, so I'll just skip over it. Neat. So it looks like we were successful, and that's about what we wanted to do. Now we can get to the interesting part and actually create our Firebase Functions project. And if you're not familiar with Firebase Functions, well, first let me just create the directory before I get ahead of myself. I'm going to name this directory YouTube API service, because this is kind of where we're going to put the main like CRUD routes for anything that we want to like manipulate on our database or our backend. Like this is going to be our real backend. So far, we have a web client, we have a video processing service that's not going to be public, but this YouTube API service is going to be public for the most part, and you'll see what I mean in a second. We're then going to navigate into that YouTube API service, and we're going to run Firebase init functions, which is going to initialize a project with Firebase functions. And when you run that, I think we're going to get prompted some stuff. Which project do we want to use? Let's say use an existing project. Of course, we're going to use the project that we created earlier, and we just have a single one here. So I'm going to press enter on that guy. And then I think it's just going to be setting up. And we get to choose the language that we want. In my case, I'm going to go with TypeScript because that's what we've been using. You could go with Python if you really want to. I think some of the functionality, though, might be limited. I think TypeScript and JavaScript have the most support, so I'm going to be sticking with that. And do we want ESLint? In our case, let's say yes. It's never bad to have a decent linter. And do we want to install all of the dependencies right now? Let's go ahead and say yes. So now I'm going to open up the window here, and we're going to see what we have generated here. First of all, there's just some Firebase configuration files. Our Firebase RC, it just tells us what project we have. Our Firebase JSON, which goes a bit more in depth, and it tells us our source code is in the functions directory for our functions project. There are other configurations we could add here, and I think we will in a bit. I want to mention that our actual NPM project is within this functions directory. You can see that's where the package JSON is, so that's where our NPM project is. So you might think like this outer folder is a bit redundant, but the reason I have it is for naming. Like it makes it clear that this is the YouTube API service, and the reason I have functions still named functions, like we could rename this to YouTube API service, but this is kind of the convention with Firebase functions, so that's why I'm leaving it as is. But I did want to just kind of explain my thought process. I won't go super in depth into the TS config because we kind of know what that is by now. It looks like it's going to include everything in the source directory in our case. And we have an ESLint file, which I think is just importing like the Google and TypeScript ESLint rules. And I think this is actually going to be a bit more strict than we had with our Next.js file. So you might even want to disable some of these, but I'm not going to, just to kind of show you a bit of how linting is. It kind of reminds me of actually linting at Google because everything is super strict there. Now we're going to go to our main file here, which is index.ts. This is like the entry point for our Firebase functions. And I might as well now tell you what a Firebase function is. There are multiple ways to define them. We'll take a look at a couple of ways, but basically they are HTTP endpoints. And they are serverless technically. Like if you've ever heard of AWS Lambda, this is kind of the equivalent service. It's built on top of containers, I think, but basically they're serverless, they're stateless, and they can scale up and scale down. And for that reason, they're pretty powerful, and they're actually really, really easy to write. In my opinion, a lot easier than actually creating and deploying a Express app. So that's why I'm sticking with this. And it's a bit of variety. Like now you're learning a new way to write an API compared to our video processing service that we wrote earlier. So maybe you don't like that variety. Maybe you're kind of overwhelmed with this, but I will say that you're probably learning a lot if you are overwhelmed. And that's what learning is all about. It's better to learn through a course like this than to learn in an overwhelmed way on a real job. That's kind of how I felt when I joined Google, to be honest. But enough talking. Let's actually take a look at this code and comment out this function here. Now, I'm going to get rid of these links, but you might consider them helpful. I'll link you some helpful links below as well. I'm going to be deleting this. I don't think it's going to be necessary in our case, but the first thing I'm going to show you is just this dummy hello world function. Of course, we're not going to be deploying this or needing it, but it's a good exercise to learn a bit about functions. Now, I'm going to quickly show you the package.json, which here you'll see it already has Firebase admin and Firebase functions installed, but I think it was recommended for us in the docs that I'll probably link below that we rerun the install for that. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to copy and paste the command, which is Firebase functions install functions latest and the admin latest. And actually, we should probably do that within the functions directory because that's where our actual project is defined. So let me copy and paste that there and let's run this command. And I don't know if that actually updated anything, and I don't know if we'll remember because I think it did actually. I think this was 11.8. Maybe it just gave us the most up-to-date version, so that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Firebase functions, as you can imagine, is going to be what contains all of like the actual Firebase functions code, which allows us to define functions. Firebase admin is basically going to allow us to read and write to our database. Basically, you only want to have Firebase admin installed in a privileged environment because if we installed that in our front end app, it'd be pretty dangerous. And we can actually, in Next.js 13, we can define backend functions within that. But the reason I'm not doing that is because I kind of prefer having a separation of concerns. Some people feel the opposite, but I don't think it's bad to have like an actual backend service. And that kind of also gives us a bit more flexibility as well. Like we don't ever have to worry about this type of package being exposed in a client-side component. At least that's my argument. And now we're actually going to test this function out locally. Thankfully, Firebase gives us an emulator, and I thought we were actually going to have to update our Firebase JSON to configure the emulator, but that's actually not the case for functions. If we wanted to emulate Firestore locally as well, we could update this, but for now, I'm not going to show you that because I want to try to keep things simple, even though we are doing quite a bit. Let me clear this. So to start the Firebase emulator, you can just type in Firebase emulators :start, and let's hope that works. We are authenticated, so it should be good. And it looks like, let me zoom out a tiny bit and make this bigger so we can see everything that it gave us. So it says there's an error, but I think that was with deploying, so I don't think that's super significant. We'll find out in a second, but basically our emulator UI can be found at localhost port 4000. So let's go ahead and open that up. So navigating to a browser window and then to localhost 4000, it looks like things are good so far. And all of these emulators you can see are turned off because we did not define them. We could if we wanted to, but I won't show you that. I'll link you to some documentation that probably will. One of them is turned on, and that's our Firebase functions because that's the one that we actually want to test. I think that's just enabled by default in our Firebase project. And if I actually click on this, we'll go to the logs page, and it looks like there actually was an error. So I kind of wonder what was causing that. Let me find out. Okay, this issue is actually my fault, and it's probably because we didn't take a close enough look at the package.json. So when you open it, I probably should have went over this earlier. There's quite a few scripts here, but we're going to pay attention to the important ones. Deploying, we'll get to that in a bit, but here you can see serve. That's for serving it locally, and you can see the steps that it's going to do that here is building the project and then starting the emulator. In our case, actually, the error message that we got, I wish I had it. I guess I'll just restart the emulator and show you the error message. It was actually pretty descriptive because it's telling us it can't find this file, this index.js file. And that's usually the result of a build step. So that tells us we forgot to build our code. So that's why I was able to figure it out pretty quickly, because thankfully the error message in this case was helpful. I can tell you that's not always the case. Basically, you don't even need to remember this command. Let's just run npm run serve. Let's do that. Let me clear this and call npm run serve. So it's even easier. Whoops, I'm probably in the wrong directory. I need to navigate to functions, and let me clear it again and then rerun that same command, and we're good to go. But like I said before, it looks like things were successful now, by the way, and our hello world function is deployed at this localhost URL. So if we want to test it out, you can copy and paste this, but you can also open the emulator. And then in the emulator, we can go to the logs page and we can see exactly that our function is at this URL. So if we want to test it out, let's copy this and open it in a new tab. I did that and look what I got. I got the string that is returned from our function that we defined. And notice also here that we did execute a log statement, hello logs. And if we navigate back to our browser and open up the logs UI, you can see somewhere here, we did get that hello logs message. And also it has a logging level, in this case, info. We could also change it to like warning or danger for when we have like an error that executes. We also see that the function successfully executed in about 3 milliseconds. So that's how we test things locally. Now let's actually create the real function that we want, which is going to create a user for us in our Firestore database that we created. So going back to the code here, what I'm going to do is actually get rid of this import because we're not going to need it, at least not for now. And I'm going to replace it with a new function, which I'm going to call create user. And this function is actually not going to be invoked by us manually. The best part is that this is sort of an event-driven function. It's going to be called automatically by Firebase every time we create a new user in Firebase Auth. So it's called functions.auth.user. And up above, I'm going to import our functions as functions, and we're going to do that from the Firebase functions package. And here, this is a function, and there's an event that we can listen to. Every time a user is created, we want to execute this function. We could also execute it when a user is deleted, but in our case, we care about when they're created. And within this, we can pass in a callback. That's exactly what I'm going to do. And this callback, by the way, is going to be given a user record. When you hover over it, you can see that's the beauty of TypeScript, and that is of type user record. So let's get our user. What do we want to do with that user? It's the user who just was created. We want to take their user info. So I'm going to extract their user info out of that record. And we're going to get specifically for now just the user ID, which thankfully with TypeScript, we can get the valid fields. We're going to get their email. We probably also want to save their email, even though it's already saved in Auth. It's good to also save it in our Firestore database. Let's also store their photo URL. I don't know if we're actually going to use this or not, but it's not bad to have. So might as well grab it while we can. So here, photo URL, and you might want to take some of their other information as well, but I'm not, into harvesting people's data, so I won't be doing that. But I think this is some pretty standard information that people would consent to. And now, before we return, we want to create a user. And actually, before I even do that, I'm going to use our logger and just say logger.info because this is not an error or anything like that. Logger and info. And we're going to just say that a user was created. Let's write it like this, user created, and let's print the user info here. And actually, I'm going to JSON stringify it because that makes the logs a little bit more readable in my opinion, especially in the GCP UI. But now we want to update Firestore. That's exactly what we got our Firebase admin for. And before we can actually use our Firebase admin, we have to import and initialize it. So we're going to import initialize app from our Firebase admin and then call it here. It's pretty simple to do. You might be wondering, how is it getting the credentials to initialize this? Well, remember locally, we called Firebase login, which basically gave it like our credentials. And when we deploy this, it's already going to have our credentials because it's deployed to our account on our project. So that's one, initialize it. And also let's get Firestore. And actually this import was a bit wrong. We want to import it from the app. I ran it original time without having that, and we actually got an error, but I won't go into detail on that. And here, let's get our Firestore. And we also want to get that from Firebase admin, and specifically this one here from Firebase admin / Firestore. And we'll create an instance of Firestore so that we can read and write from there in our privileged environment, which we are currently inside of. And this is actually an object, so we need to put new here. It's not a function, it's an object. And then we get Firestore here. So that was a bit of setup for us to write this very beautiful write, which is going to be, so for Firestore, which collection do we want to to write to, that's probably the first thing we should specify. And let's say we want to do the users collection, and which document do we want to write to? We can specify that with the ID of the document. And let's say, what do you think we should use for the document ID? I think user ID is probably a good one. That's a good key to have. So let's use user ID. And I think actually we can do it like this, user.uid. And then for this, what is the document that we want to set? Well, that's why we created this object here. So I'm just going to pass in user info, and that's the document that we're creating. Now you might be wondering, this collection doesn't exist yet, does it? And this document doesn't exist yet either. Well, that's what this call is going to do. If the collection doesn't exist, this will create one. If the document doesn't exist, this will create one, and it will set it to this information. So this is pretty much all the code. It's not much, and I'm defining it in index.ts because this is like the entry point of Firebase functions. Every function exported from here is going to be deployed, and I'm actually going to show you how to do that right now. Now, the first time I did this, when I was deploying, I had an error. So I'm actually going to run npm install just to fix that, because that fixed it for me the previous time. It might fix it for you. If you still run into errors trying to deploy, you might have to delete your node modules folder and then rerun npm install. But hopefully that's not the case. Now, to actually deploy, it's pretty easy. And I'll actually not show you the script here. I'll just go to package.json, which is going to do pretty much everything for us. npm deploy. We'll call that with npm run deploy. I don't know how that got cut off. I don't know if this is going to work. Okay, it works. That's weird. It's probably just a visual bug. Okay, and we got some errors, and this is from our linter. This is why I recommended you might want to turn it off. In my case, I won't. I'll just kind of show you how to fix these errors. Basically, it's telling us that we don't want spaces with our curly braces, and I know exactly where that's coming from. Basically, in our imports here, for some reason, the Google styler doesn't want us to have white space here. It's a bit different than what you might be used to. And with objects, they need to have trailing commas. So we're adding a trailing comma there. So that's pretty easy to fix. And now I'm going to rerun npm run deploy. Great, and it looks like the deployment was successful. So let me quickly show that to you in the UI right now. Navigating to the Firebase console, you can open up the functions UI, and I believe we have a function deployed. So let me actually refresh that. Okay, looks like it's working now. We have our create user function, and it's triggered by the user create event. Now, if we wanted to, we could also define a function that's triggered via a HTTPS endpoint. Like we could manually trigger ourselves, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit. For now, we have our create user function, and Cloud Functions, just like Firestore, is actually also a service on GCP. So if I go to GCP and open up a new window and I go to the functions UI, you'll see that the exact same function is deployed in Cloud Functions. It's a generation 1 function, which I believe we can only have generation 1 functions for this event, like the create user trigger. Or else I would do the second generation, because the second generation are just a bit more powerful. Well, probably a lot more powerful, but we won't go super in depth into that. Basically, I wanted to show you this UI also exists, and it's a bit more comprehensive than the Cloud Functions UI. Like here, we can also see logs and stuff like that. I think here we'd have to open it up. Actually, it just takes you to the Cloud Functions UI. So yeah, this is a more powerful UI. You can see more details about it. You can see more logs and things like that. Now, for the moment of truth, let's actually test it out. I'm a little bit nervous again. Let's navigate here. First of all, I still have this running, by the way. You might need to restart it. This is our Next.js client. I'm going to go to authentication, and I'm going to delete this user because we can't trigger that function we created unless we actually create a new user. So I'm going to delete this guy. There we go. Now here you can see I'm currently signed in, but I bet if I refresh, this is going to change, because if we deleted our user, then there's no way we can be signed in. Yep, that's exactly what it did. Now I'm going to sign in again, and I'm going to sign in, and it signed me automatically with Grace Allen. So now if we go to Firebase Functions, let's see the user was created, and that should have triggered our Firebase function. Let's see it here. Sometimes it can take a second, so let me refresh. So far, it says the request wasn't triggered yet. Maybe it's just taking a bit. It can sometimes take a cold start. I mentioned that this service can scale up and scale down. So if it's scaled to 0, it can sometimes take a few seconds for it to actually execute. And it looks like it did execute. So that's good. Now, for the real moment of truth, was it able to create a user for us in our Firestore database? Let's open up the UI for that and confirm. Yep, it created the collection. It created the user, and it created created all the information that we wanted to. Let me even open up that profile URL to confirm, copying that and opening it. Yeah, that's our profile picture. Well, at least that's mine. You might have a different one. And let's just make sure the user ID here matches the user ID in authentication, which it probably does. Yeah, it looks about the same to me. Great. We did a lot in this video. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming, but things are finally starting to come together. Next up, we're going to be uploading videos from the UI as well. That's going to be a fun one.